If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you that Sarah and I had it all figured out. Our life looked like something out of one of those cheesy Hallmark commercials. 2 kids, a Labrador named Max, and a house with a freshly mowed lawn. We weren't perfect, sure, but I thought we were solid. I think that's what hurts the most looking back on it. I wasn't some clueless husband ignoring the signs. I was a guy who trusted his wife because I believed that's what marriage was all about. Turns out, trust can make you blind to what's right in front of you. It started off small little things that were easy to dismiss. Sarah said she was going to yoga after work a couple of times a week. At first I thought it was great. She had always talked about needing to focus more on self-care, so I encouraged it. But then there were little clues, like how she'd come home without a drop of sweat on her makeup still perfect. She'd be wearing that floral perfume she didn't used to wear around me. Yoga was relaxing, she'd say, breezing past me to take a quick shower. She wasn't lying, not really. She was just relaxing in ways I didn't want to think about. It wasn't until one night when I was folding laundry that the first real crack appeared. I found it in her jacket pocket, crumpled up and stuffed in like an afterthought, a receipt from a high-end restaurant downtown. Not just any restaurant though. This was the kind of place where you had to book weeks in advance, where the wine menu didn't even have prices listed. 2 glasses of champagne. A dessert platter for 2. I stared at that receipt like it was a math problem I couldn't solve. My first thought was, who was she with? My second thought was, why didn't she tell me about this? I didn't say anything that night. It could have been innocent. Maybe a coworker's birthday or a client meeting. I wasn't going to accuse her of anything, yet. But that receipt stayed with me, sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. The next week I started noticing other things. She was using our joint account for charges that didn't make sense. There were flowers, movie tickets, and even a hotel booking. It wasn't one big thing, but a pattern that started to form a picture I didn't want to see. One night after she left for yoga, I decided to check her location. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but the curiosity, and the doubt, was eating me alive. I installed a tracking app on her phone under the guise of a family safety feature. I told myself it was harmless, just to ease my mind. That night, she wasn't at the yoga studio. The app showed her at a hotel about 10 minutes from our house. I told myself it could still be innocent. Maybe there was an explanation. But then the app pinged again and my stomach sank. She stayed there for 2 hours. When she finally got home, her story was the same. Yoga had been so good that she'd lost track of time chatting with her instructor. The next day I couldn't focus at work. I replayed her words over and over in my head, trying to figure out if she'd always been this good at lying. By the time I got home, I'd already made up my mind. The following week, I told her I was going to the gym after work. Instead, I drove to that hotel and parked across the street. I waited there for what felt like an eternity, watching every car that pulled into the lot. And then I saw them. Sarah walked out with him, Brian, her colleague. I recognized him immediately. She'd mentioned him in passing, always brushing off his name like he was just another guy at the office. But now he was holding her hand, laughing like they were teenagers on a first date. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to get out of the car, march up to them, and demand an explanation. But something stopped me. Confronting her now wouldn't fix this. If anything, it'd give her the chance to deny it, to spin a story. No, if she wanted to treat me like I was an idiot, I was going to play along. But I wasn't going to stay quiet. The next morning, while Sarah was in the shower, I set up a camera in our bedroom. It wasn't some amateur gadget either. This thing was discreet, hidden in a clock on the dresser. She wouldn't even notice it unless she knew to look for it. That week, I pretended everything was fine. I kissed her goodbye in the mornings, asked her how her yoga sessions went, even helped with the kids' homework like nothing had changed. But inside, I was unraveling. 2 days later, Brian showed up at our house in the middle of the day. I watched the live feed from my phone as they went into our bedroom. When I finally watched the footage that evening, I thought I'd be angry, but all I felt was numb. There they were, in the bed we'd shared for years, laughing and kissing like they didn't have a care in the world. It was surreal. I'd spent years building a life with Sarah, trusting her, loving her, and now I was watching her throw it all away for this guy. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. But I wasn't done. If Sarah thought she could do this to me and get away with it, she was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't just going to confront her, I was going to make her regret every decision she'd made. She wanted to break our family apart? Fine. But I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the pain she'd caused me. The day after I watched that footage, I woke up different. The hurt was still there, simmering under the surface, but now it was something sharper. A purpose. A plan. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee while Sarah moved around the house, getting the kids ready for school. She looked so normal, so ordinary. Made me sick. How could she act like everything was fine? Like she wasn't sneaking around behind my back? Don't forget about date night this weekend, she said, smiling at me like she wasn't lying through her teeth. I nodded, forcing a smile back. Looking forward to it? But I wasn't looking forward to anything with her. I was looking forward to making her world crumble the way she'd crushed mine. The first thing I did was save the footage. Not just one clip, several. I combed through the recordings from the camera, piecing together every incriminating moment into a tidy little collection. Then I started thinking bigger. It wasn't enough to catch her in the act. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to sit there and see exactly what I saw. That's when the idea hit me. I spent the rest of the week putting it together. At work, I was efficient, smiling at meetings, nodding along to presentations. Nobody would have guessed that every free moment I had was spent editing a video that would make Sarah and Brian's lives implode. I started with the happy stuff. Our wedding footage, home videos of the kids, vacations we'd taken as a family. All those moments that were supposed to mean something. Then I transitioned into the surveillance footage. Sarah kissing Brian in our bedroom, him pulling her close, her smiling like a lovesick teenager. For good measure, I added captions. Sarcastic, biting ones. When they kissed, a caption popped up. Yoga stretch number 1, the pretzel. When Brian laughed at something she said, I added, hitting the mat hard, huh, Sarah? I wasn't aiming for subtle. I even layered in dramatic music for the final moments. It was petty and over the top, but I didn't care. This wasn't about being classy. This was about making a point. But just exposing her wasn't enough. Brian needed to feel it too. I started digging into him, his social media, LinkedIn, anything I could find. It didn't take long to discover that his company had a strict anti-fraternization policy. Relationships between co-workers weren't just frowned upon. They were grounds for termination. Perfect. The next step was setting the stage. I told Sarah I wanted to plan a special dinner for us, just the two of us. She seemed surprised, but she didn't question it. That sounds amazing, she said, kissing me on the cheek. I'll clear my schedule. Great, I replied, barely suppressing a smirk. Of course it wasn't just for us. I had a little surprise in mind. When the night came, I told her to get dressed up. It's a celebration, I said, something special for the two of us. She came downstairs wearing this black dress that used to take my breath away. Now I couldn't stand to look at it. While she was upstairs getting ready, I made the final preparations. The dining table was set, candles, the good plates, the whole 9 yards. I even had wine chilling, a bottle we'd been saving for a special occasion. Fitting, I thought bitterly. I sent Brian a text from Sarah's phone. Come over. Jack has a surprise. Simple but effective. I figured he wouldn't question it. He'd probably assume she wanted to sneak him in after dinner. When the doorbell rang, Sarah looked up from her glass of wine, confused. Who's that? No idea, I said, standing to answer the door. And there he was. Brian. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw me. That deer-in-the-headlights expression, like he'd just walked into oncoming traffic. Brian? I said, grinning wide. Come in. You're just in time. Thanks, he stammered, stepping inside. His eyes darted to Sarah, who was sitting frozen at the table, her face pale. What's going on? I thought we'd all have dinner together, I said, clapping him on the back. Celebrate. Celebrate what? Sarah finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the living room, grabbed the laptop I'd hidden there earlier, and brought it to the dining room. You'll see, I said, setting it on the table. What is this? Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. I pressed play. The video started innocently enough. Footage from our wedding, the kids playing in the yard, a montage of family moments. For a second I saw Sarah relax. Then the screen shifted. It was her and Brian. In our bedroom. The color drained from her face. Brian looked like he was about to throw up. What the hell is this? He demanded, but his voice cracked halfway through. Oh, just a little something I put together, I said, leaning back in my chair. You like it? Sarah started babbling, trying to explain, but I held up a hand. Save it. I don't want to hear it. You've said enough already. By the time the video ended, they were both sitting in stunned silence. Brian looked like he wanted to crawl out of his skin. Sarah was crying, her makeup streaked and messy. This is just the beginning, I said, standing up. Enjoy the dinner. I've got other plans tonight. I walked out of the house, leaving them alone with the wreckage. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Brian had no idea what was coming next, and Sarah, well, she'd just seen the first act. I spent the next day tying up loose ends. Brian wasn't going to slink away from this unscathed. Sarah? She'd already felt the sting of humiliation during that dinner, but for Brian, I wanted something a little more public. First, I went back to the footage. I edited the video down to just the damning parts of him and Sarah in our bedroom. No captions, no dramatic flair this time, just cold, hard evidence. I kept the tone serious, like something you'd see in a workplace ethics seminar. I attached the video to an email and drafted a message to Brian's boss. Short and sweet. Subject: urgent, violation of company policies. Dear boss's name? I am writing to bring to your attention a matter that may be in violation of your company's anti-fraternization policy. The attached video shows two of your employees, Sarah, last name, and Brian, last name, engaging in an extramarital relationship. I thought it best you be made aware of this situation, as it could reflect poorly on your company's reputation. Sincerely, a concerned party. I sent the email first thing in the morning, right before I left for work. It was satisfying to imagine Brian sweating bullets when his boss called him in to discuss the situation. That evening, Sarah tried to talk to me. She'd been avoiding me all day, probably because she knew she had no excuse left. But when I came home from work, she was waiting in the kitchen, pacing like a caged animal. Jack, we need to talk, she started, her voice shaky. I set my bag down and crossed my arms. Talk about what, Sarah? How you threw away our marriage. Or how you thought I wouldn't notice. She flinched like I'd slapped her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Really? I said, my voice sharp. How exactly was it supposed to go? You sneak around with Brian and I'm just none the wiser forever? She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her answer. You know what? Forget it. I don't care why you did it anymore. What I care about now is what happens next. I'm done pretending this can be fixed. Jack, please? I held up my hand. Save it. If you're about to beg, don't. It's not going to work. She broke down crying right there, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the image of her and Brian in our bed, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, and the sympathy vanished. I'm filing for divorce, I said simply, turning toward the stairs. Jack, wait, she cried, but I didn't stop. Her words were just noise to me now. The fallout with Brian happened faster than I expected. 2 days after I sent the email, I got an anonymous tip. One of his coworkers, maybe, letting me know that Brian had been terminated. Apparently, the company didn't take kindly to employees having affairs, especially when one of them sent a video exposing it. I couldn't help but smile when I heard. One down, one to go. With Brian out of the way, my focus shifted back to Sarah. She still hadn't told the kids what was going on, and I wasn't about to let them live in ignorance. They deserved the truth no matter how ugly it was. The night I sat them down was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Our son Jake is 12, and our daughter Emma is 8, too young to really understand everything, but old enough to know that their world was about to change. Mom, and I need to tell you something, I started, my throat tight. Sarah sat across from me, her face pale. We've decided that we can't stay together anymore. Emma burst into tears immediately, clutching her stuffed bunny like it could somehow protect her from what was coming. Jake just sat there, staring at the table. Why? He asked, his voice flat. I hesitated, glancing at Sarah. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they love, I said carefully. Your mom made a choice and it's not something I can forgive. Dad, Jake said, his voice sharper now. What did she do? I didn't sugarcoat it. She cheated, Jake. She broke our trust. Jake's face crumpled and he pushed back his chair so hard it almost toppled over. You're lying, he yelled, running upstairs before I could say anything else. Jack, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. You didn't have to tell them like that. Like what? I snapped. The truth? They're not stupid, Sarah. They would have figured it out eventually. She didn't respond, just buried her face in her hands. I sat there listening to Emma's quiet sobs, feeling like the worst father in the world. But at least I was being honest with them. At least they'd know the truth. The next day I took it a step further. The master bedroom, the place that had once been ours, had become a shrine to betrayal. I spent the morning tearing it apart. I took down the photos of us together, replacing them with ones I'd printed out. Snapshots from the video, stills of her and Brian in bed. On the wall above the bed, I hung a sign I'd made with black paint and a piece of scrap wood from the garage. Here lies my love. It was dramatic, sure, but if Sarah wanted to remember what she'd done every time she walked into that room, I was happy to oblige. I wasn't staying there anymore anyway. I'd already moved my things into the guest room. When Sarah came home and saw what I'd done, she lost it. "You're being petty, Jack," she yelled. "What's the point of all this?" I shrugged. "The point is that actions have consequences, Sarah. You made your bed, literally. Now you get to lie in it." The day I filed for divorce felt surreal. I walked into the courthouse with a folder full of evidence, the video burned onto a flash drive, and a stack of printouts of our bank statements showing Sarah's suspicious expenses. I wasn't just walking in there to end my marriage. I was walking in there to make sure Sarah didn't get away with what she'd done. It took a couple of hours to finalize the paperwork, and by the end of it I felt a strange sense of calm. Like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The clerk handed me the stamped copies, and I left the courthouse knowing the ball was officially rolling. That evening I told Sarah. She must have sensed it was coming because when I walked in, she was sitting at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea like it was the only thing holding her together. "We need to talk," I said, setting my bag down. She looked up at me with tired eyes. "What now?" "I filed for divorce today." Her face crumpled. "Jack, no. Please, we can work this out. We can go to counseling or—" "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "You don't get to act like this is something we can fix. You made your choice, Sarah. Now I'm making mine." She started crying big, ugly sobs that made me feel something close to pity. But pity wasn't going to change my mind. "There's more," I said, sitting across from her. "I'm filing for full custody of the kids." Her head snapped up. "You can't do that. Jack, you can't just take my children away from me." "They're not just your children," I snapped. "They're ours. And after what you've done, I think it's pretty clear which one of us is better suited to take care of them." Her tears turned to anger. "You can't use this, what happened with Brian, as a reason to take them from me. That's cruel, Jack." "No, Sarah," I said, leaning forward. "What's cruel is breaking up our family because you couldn't keep your promises. What's cruel is making me explain to Jake and Emma why their mom isn't the person they thought she was. You don't get to lecture me about cruelty." She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. "The papers are filed. If you want to fight for custody, be my guest. But I'm warning you, I've got evidence that shows exactly what kind of choices you've been making. And trust me, a judge isn't going to look kindly on a mother who prioritizes her affair over her kids." She stared at me, her face a mix of fury and devastation. "You're punishing me," she said finally. "You don't care about what's best for the kids. You just want revenge." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're damn right I want revenge. But don't think for a second that I don't care about those kids. I'm doing this for them, Sarah. Because they deserve better than what you've given them." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, documenting everything, and preparing for what I knew would be a messy custody battle. But for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like I was in control. Jake had stopped speaking to Sarah altogether. Anytime she tried to talk to him, he'd shrug her off with one-word answers or lock himself in his room. Emma was a different story. She was too young to fully grasp what was happening, but she could sense the tension in the house. "Is Mommy mad at you?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. "No, sweetie," I said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Mommy and I are just figuring some things out." "Is it because of Brian?" she whispered. I froze. "What do you mean?" "I heard Jake say it," she said, clutching her bunny tightly. "He said Mommy loves Brian more than us." My chest tightened. "That's not true," I said carefully. "Your mom loves you very much. She just made a mistake." Emma nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. How could she be? The truth was too big, too ugly for an 8-year-old to understand. Sarah tried to put on a brave face, but the cracks were showing. She started spending more time at work, probably hoping the distraction would make her feel better. But every time she came home, she'd find the museum I'd made of our bedroom, a constant reminder of what she'd done. One night, I heard her crying in there. I didn't check on her. Let her cry. The next day, I came home to find the photos torn down and the sign I'd painted tossed in the trash. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. But it didn't matter. Her guilt wasn't something she could erase with a clean wall. When the custody hearing finally arrived, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. I had everything I needed: the video, the financial records, and even a statement from Jake, who'd asked to speak to the judge directly. Sarah's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, claiming I was using the affair to punish her. But the evidence spoke for itself. The judge didn't just see a betrayed husband. He saw a father who wanted to protect his kids from a toxic environment. By the end of it, I had primary custody, with Sarah getting supervised visitation every other weekend. It wasn't a complete win. Emma still needed her mother, and I wasn't going to take that away from her, but it was enough. When the judge read the decision, Sarah burst into tears. Her lawyer patted her shoulder, but she didn't look at me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was relief. The kids were mine to protect now, and I wasn't going to let Sarah's mistakes ruin their future. After the custody hearing, Sarah was a shadow of the person she used to be. The confident, composed woman who once glided through life with ease now seemed broken, unsure of herself. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but every time I looked at our kids, at Jake's anger and Emma's confusion, I remembered what she'd done to us. She started texting me more after the decision, trying to open lines of communication. Most of it was logistical, questions about the kids' schedules, school projects, doctor appointments. But every so often she'd try to slip something else in. I miss them so much, she texted one night after her first weekend visitation ended. I ignored it. Jack, can we talk? I want to apologize, she sent another time. Left that one on read too. Her desperation started showing in other ways. She'd linger too long when she came to pick up the kids, hovering in the doorway like she was searching for an opening. Sometimes she'd bring little gifts, cookies, toys, things she knew the kids liked. At first, I let it slide, but then it started feeling manipulative, like she was trying to buy their love. One Saturday, Jake came downstairs holding a new video game. Mom got this for me, he said, his tone flat. She's not supposed to be giving you things like that, I said, barely masking my frustration. I didn't ask for it, he replied, tossing the game onto the coffee table. She just handed it to me and said it was a surprise. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Jake had been distant ever since I told him about Sarah's affair. He didn't lash out, but there was this quiet resentment that clung to him, especially when it came to her. Do you want to keep it? I asked. He shrugged. I don't care. Later that day, when Sarah came to pick up Emma, I met her at the door. Stop with the gifts, I said bluntly. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? The video games, the toys, the treats. Stop. You think that's going to fix things with Jake? Her face crumpled. I'm just trying to show them I care, Jack. You don't show them you care by throwing things at them, I snapped. You show them by being there, by owning up to your mistakes. Jake doesn't want your gifts, Sarah. He wants his mom back. She started to cry, but I didn't feel like comforting her. Not anymore. Take Emma, I said, stepping back. Your time's almost up anyway. Later that evening, while the kids were in bed, I got another text from Sarah. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you and I hurt them. Please, Jack, I just want to talk. Let me make things right. I stared at the message for a long time before finally replying. Making things right starts with the kids. Focus on them. She didn't respond after that. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice small changes in Sarah. She was more present during her visits, less focused on trying to win Jake over with flashy gestures. I could see her trying, asking about their school projects, helping Emma with her math homework, and even sitting through one of Jake's long, rambling monologues about his favorite sci-fi series. But Jake wasn't budging. One night, as I was tucking him in, I asked him about it. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? I asked gently. He was quiet for a moment, staring up at the ceiling. I don't know, he said finally. She broke everything, Dad. How do you forgive someone for that? I didn't have an answer. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my own life. I moved out of the guest room and into the master bedroom, but not before giving it a much-needed makeover. The bed was new, the walls were freshly painted, and every trace of Sarah and Brian's betrayal was gone. I even started going out again, reconnecting with old friends I hadn't seen in years. At first, it felt strange, awkward, like I was trying to step into a life that no longer fit me. But gradually it started to feel normal. One night, my buddy Eric convinced me to join him for drinks at a new bar downtown. You've been cooped up for too long, he said, dragging me out of the house. Come on, Jack. It's time to start living again. I wasn't expecting much, but by the end of the night I found myself laughing, actually enjoying myself for the first time in months. It wasn't some dramatic turning point where everything suddenly felt okay, but it was a start. Sarah must have noticed the shift in me because she started pushing harder to reconcile. Jack, she said one afternoon as she picked up the kids, can we just sit down and talk? Please? I shook my head. There's nothing to talk about, Sarah. Yes, there is, she insisted. I want to apologize properly. I want to tell you how sorry I am, how much I regret everything. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. It's too late for that, I said firmly. Jack, please, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I still love you. Doesn't that count for something? I stared at her, my expression hard. Love doesn't fix what you broke, Sarah. It doesn't make this better. I don't hate you, but I can't forgive you either. Not now. Maybe not ever. Her shoulders sagged and she nodded slowly. I understand, she whispered. Good, I said, stepping back. Now focus on being a good mom. That's what matters now. As she drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and a faint glimmer of hope. Not for us, but for the future. After that last conversation with Sarah, something shifted. It wasn't a clean break, healing never is, but it felt like a door quietly closing on a chapter of my life. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but I had moved past the stage where I was consumed by anger. Now it was about moving forward, step by step, finding a version of life that didn't have Sarah in the center of it. It was harder than I thought. The house felt quieter even with the kids around. I'd see reminders of her everywhere: her favorite mug in the cabinet, the blanket she always used on the couch, the spot in the garden where she used to plant tulips every spring. I started throwing some things out and boxing up others, but there were certain things I couldn't touch, things that still belonged to the kids. Jake and Emma were handling the changes in their own ways. Jake barely mentioned Sarah unless he had to, and Emma, well, she asked a lot of questions. Do you still love Mommy? She asked one night as I tucked her in. The question stopped me in my tracks. I sat down on the edge of her bed, thinking carefully about how to answer. Emma, sometimes when someone hurts you really badly, it's hard to love them the same way, I said gently. But I'll always care about her because she's your mom, and she loves you very much. Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. I love you both, she said softly, pulling her bunny closer. I know, sweetie, I said, kissing her forehead. And that's okay. You don't have to choose. I tried to keep myself busy. Work was a good distraction, but I found myself coming home every night with too much time to think. Eric, my friend who had dragged me out to that bar, started checking in more often. You're not turning into one of those sad divorced dads who lives in sweatpants, are you? He joked one night as we grabbed burgers. Not yet, I said, laughing. Good, he said, pointing at me with a fry. Because you're not that guy, Jack. You've been through hell, but you're coming out the other side. You're doing great with the kids, and honestly, I think you're handling this better than most people would. I shrugged, not feeling particularly great about anything, but his words stuck with me. It wasn't long after that when I decided to write everything down. At first, it was just for myself. I'd sit at my desk late at night, typing out the whole mess: the discovery, the betrayal, the dinner, the fallout. It felt good to get it out of my head, to see it laid out in black and white. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that maybe someone else needed to hear it too. I wasn't the only guy who'd been through something like this. There were probably others out there, sitting in the dark, wondering how their lives had fallen apart so quickly. So one night I hit post. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, comments started pouring in. Some were from men who'd been through similar betrayals, thanking me for putting their feelings into words. Others were from women, offering perspectives I hadn't considered. You handled this with so much grace, one comment read. I hope your kids know how lucky they are to have a dad like you. I went through something similar, another said. Reading your story helped me feel less alone. Thank you for sharing. It wasn't just validation, it was connection. For the first time since this all began, I didn't feel like I was fighting this battle on my own. Over the weeks, my post gained traction. People started messaging me directly, sharing their own stories or asking for advice. Some of them were in the middle of divorces. Others were trying to rebuild their lives after infidelity. One message in particular stuck with me. It was from a man named Ben who'd found out his wife had been cheating with her boss. I don't know how to move on, he wrote. Every time I look at her, I feel like I'm losing my mind. How did you do it? I took a deep breath before replying. Hey Ben. I'm not going to lie to you, it's hard. There were days when I felt like I couldn't get out of bed, when the anger and sadness were all I could think about. But you have to take it one day at a time. Focus on what you can control. For me, it was my kids. They became my reason to keep going. Find your reason, whatever it is, and hold on to it. You're stronger than you think. He replied a day later, thanking me. As the months passed, I started to feel like myself again. I wasn't fully healed, some scars never fade, but I wasn't drowning anymore. Sarah, to her credit, seemed to take my advice. She threw herself into being a better mom, making the most of her limited time with the kids. Jake was still distant, but Emma was warming up to her again. I didn't interfere. That wasn't my battle to fight. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Jake came into the kitchen holding a notebook. Dad, he said, are you really okay with everything that happened? I stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. Why do you ask? I read your post, he said. The one about what happened with Mom? My heart dropped. Jake, that post wasn't for you. I didn't want you to. It's fine, he said quickly. I wanted to know how you felt. I think I get it now. I didn't know what to say. I'm still mad at her, he admitted, his voice cracking. But I'm glad you're okay. I hugged him tightly, my throat tight. I'm glad you're okay too, I said. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. The kids were thriving, I was reconnecting with old friends, and Sarah, well, she was figuring out her own path. I'd survived the storm, and for the first time in a long time, the horizon looked clear. The day the divorce was finalized felt like stepping into cold water, bracing, shocking, but somehow invigorating. I was sitting in the courtroom, my lawyer by my side, when the judge reviewed the final paperwork. Sarah sat a few feet away, clutching a tissue and avoiding my eyes. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the last few months had finally worn her down. When the judge officially declared the marriage dissolved, I didn't feel the sense of triumph I thought I might. Instead, it was more like a door creaking shut behind me, quiet, inevitable. Sarah didn't try to talk to me as we left the courthouse, which was a blessing. I didn't think I had anything left to say to her. Instead, I drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat in the car for a few minutes staring at the house. This place had been our dream once. Now it was mine and the kids, and a reminder of what we'd lost. That evening I told Jake and Emma the news. Mom and I are officially divorced, I said, sitting across from them at the kitchen table. Jake nodded, his face unreadable. He'd been preparing for this, and I could tell he'd already made peace with it in his way. Emma, on the other hand, burst into tears. What does that mean? She sobbed. Are we still a family? Of course we are, I said, pulling her into my lap. We're still a family, Emma. That doesn't change. It just means that Mom and I won't be living together anymore. But you don't love each other, she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I took a deep breath. We don't love each other the way we used to, but we both love you and Jake. That's never going to change. It was the truth, or at least as much of it as she needed to hear. Over the next few days, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey, how it started with a crumpled receipt, how it spiraled into deception, and how I'd somehow managed to crawl out of the wreckage with my sanity intact. The anger was mostly gone now, replaced by a strange sense of detachment. I still didn't forgive Sarah, not completely, but I didn't feel the need to punish her anymore. She was doing enough of that to herself. Even Brian had faded into the background. I hadn't heard a peep about him since he got fired. Maybe he'd left town, or maybe he was still licking his wounds somewhere, trying to figure out how his life had gone so wrong. Either way, I didn't care. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of Sarah and me on vacations at family gatherings, smiling like nothing could ever go wrong. I almost deleted them all but stopped myself. Those moments had been real, even if they were now overshadowed by what came after. Erasing them wouldn't change what had happened, it would just feel like lying to myself. So instead, I moved them into a folder labeled Past Life and tucked it away in the cloud. Out of sight but not gone. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected call from Sarah. Hi Jack, she said, her voice hesitant. I just wanted to say, thank you. I blinked, caught off guard. For what? For being a good dad, she said. And for letting me still be a part of their lives. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I'm doing it for them, I said finally. Not for you. I know, she said softly. But it still means a lot. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I was grateful for that. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Eric convinced me to join a local running group, which was less about running and more about chatting while pretending to exercise. Through that, I met people, single dads, divorcees, even a few couples who had weathered their own storms. One woman, Laura, caught my eye. She was funny, kind, and had this infectious energy that made everyone around her smile. She'd been divorced for 3 years and, like me, was figuring out how to rebuild her life. At first, I wasn't sure I was ready for anything more than friendship, but as we started talking more, I realized how easy it was to be around her. She wasn't pushy or overly eager, she was just herself. One evening, after a group run, she walked up to me, her cheeks pink from the cold. You're doing great, Jack, she said with a smile. Thanks, I replied. I'm just trying to keep up. You're doing more than that, she said. And if you ever feel like grabbing a coffee, outside of this chaos, I'd like that. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a new beginning. I didn't rush into anything with Laura. For now I was focused on the kids, on building a life that felt stable and good. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to think about the future. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define me. Months after the divorce was finalized, life started to feel normal again. Not the old normal, but a new one that I was slowly learning to accept. The kids were settling into the routine of having two homes. Emma, bless her heart, bounced back quicker than I expected. She still asked questions sometimes, trying to piece together why everything had changed, but her resilience amazed me. Jake, on the other hand, carried his feelings like armor. He still barely spoke to Sarah during her visitation weekends. When he was home with me, he'd throw himself into school projects or video games, only occasionally letting his guard down long enough to talk about how he was really feeling. One night, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, sketching something in his notebook. "What are you working on?" I asked, pulling up a chair. He shrugged, holding up the page. It was a drawing of a family, 3 figures standing together with a smaller one off to the side. "It's us," he said, pointing to the group of 3. "And that's Mom." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You know, Jake, it's okay to let her in. She's still your mom." "She hurt you," he said bluntly, his pencil digging into the paper. "She hurt all of us." "She did," I admitted. "But part of being strong is figuring out how to move forward. It doesn't mean you have to forget or even forgive, but holding on to the anger will only hurt you in the long run." He didn't say anything, but later that night, I heard him answer one of Sarah's texts. It wasn't much, a short reply about school, but it was a start. Meanwhile, I was slowly building a new life for myself. I didn't expect miracles or grand epiphanies. Healing wasn't a straight line, it was messy, full of stops and starts. But I was getting there. The running group had become a regular part of my week, and Laura was still around. We'd gone out for coffee a few times, and she'd even met Jake and Emma, just as a friend for now. She had a way of making people feel at ease, and I found myself looking forward to her texts and the way she'd poke fun at my terrible running form. "Your dad runs like a wounded giraffe," she told Emma once, making her giggle. "Don't give her any ideas," I said, pretending to glare. Emma just grinned. "He does, though. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something good." One evening, as I sat at my desk, I opened the online forum where I'd first shared my story. The post had taken on a life of its own, with hundreds of comments from people sharing their own tales of heartbreak and recovery. Scrolling through the responses, I came across a question from someone who just found out about their partner's infidelity. "How do you move on?" they wrote. "How do you stop feeling like your whole world is crashing down?" I thought about that for a long time before typing my reply. "You don't move on all at once," I wrote. "It's not about waking up one day and feeling fine. It's about small steps. You focus on the things you can control, your kids, your health, your hobbies, and you take it one day at a time. Some days will feel impossible. You'll want to scream, cry, or punch a hole in the wall. That's okay. Feel it. Let it out. But don't let it define you. And remember, betrayal says more about the person who did it than it does about you. It's not your fault, and it doesn't mean you're unworthy of love. You're stronger than you think. Trust me, I've been there." That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, as the sun poured into the kitchen, Emma sat at the table drawing while Jake read something on his tablet. I stood at the counter, flipping pancakes and sipping coffee, feeling a strange but welcome sense of peace. The storm was over. It didn't mean everything was perfect. There would still be hard days, and I'd still carry scars from what had happened. But those scars didn't hurt like they used to. They were just part of me now. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen and I will see you there.